Kingsley Amos's 1954 novel, Lucky Jim, features a historian called Jim Dixon who has published an essay entitled The Economic Influence of the Developments in Shipbuilding Techniques, 1450 to 1485. It's a perfect title, Amos tells us, in that it crystallised the article's niggling mindlessness, its funereal parade of yawning, enforcing facts, the pseudo-light it threw upon non-problems. It is, Dixon laments, useless. Over 100 years earlier, Walter Scott had similarly dedicated his historical novel Ivanhoe to the Reverend Dr. Dry as Dust, who bemoans the fact that in England, our ideas of our ancestors are only to be gleaned from musty records and chronicles, the authors of which seem perversely to have conspired to suppress in their narratives all interesting details. Dickens' Hard Times opens with a satirical characterisation of the Victorian emphasis on the factual. The teacher, Thomas Gradgrind, proclaims that, "Now, what I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are wanted in life. Plant nothing else and root out everything else. You can only form the minds of reasoning animals upon facts. Nothing else will ever be of any service to them. This is the principle on which I bring up my own children, and this is the principle on which I bring up these children. Stick to the facts, sir. 2 + 2 is 4, he rallies, and nothing more." But could there be more? Facts and nothing more might summarise the scientific method, objectivity, detachment. Descartes, Kant, Mill and others all emphasised the rational human who could detach themselves from the world, observing and calculating, absorbing the facts. The idea of detachment characterises the approach of both the social and the natural sciences. But what exactly does detachment mean? That an observer can put their own feelings, imagination and biases to one side, to detach themselves from their subject matter and rationally collect all of the facts. Much postmodern theory might be summarised as problematising this idea of detachment. Rather than being detached and rational Cartesian egos, we are subjectified by and the product of innumerable epistemological, economic or cultural structures, theoretical trends, personal sentiments, unquantifiable feelings and irrational choices. Historians, for example, take the facts, documents, diaries, minutes, schedules, reports, newspaper articles, and turn them into narratives. They're meant to be detached from the sources, to judge them objectively. But, biases and ideological dispositions put aside for a moment, the narrative that they produce is not the same as the raw data, and certainly then not the same as the past that the raw data is meant to give access to. The narrative is imagined by the historian. It's a product of their minds. Hayden White has emphasised this fact. The historian, he says, makes choices about the facts that aren't anything to do with the real past, but to do with the historian's personal preferences in the present, in their minds. Historians transform chronicles, events and dates with no beginnings or ends, interpretation or analysis, into stories by identifying, ordering and adding to the individual data contained within them. They produce narratives according to ideological, aesthetic and linguistic norms and beliefs in the present. As White suggests, choices may not determine the entire account, but instead can be identified in the tone or the mood of individual words, passages or chapters. Drawing on White, Beverly Southgate has similarly argued that, as with fiction, these choices are imagined in the present. Abstract ideas are fictions. They're the product of human minds. Because of this, history and fiction are inseparably twined. Empirical sources are mixed with imagined attitudes that are the product of the author's mind, their individual fancy, the authentic mixed with the fabulous. These fictions are drawn from moral and personal attitudes about the world, are influenced by the appropriateness of those attitudes, and often, like novels, provide morally desirable examples for emulation, confirming identities or justifying institutions, national boundaries, or philosophical values. By this definition, narrative, being the product of human thought, is as much fiction as empirical fact. Historian Alan Munslow also emphasises that histories are textual. They're not the same as the multiplicitous and infinite perspectives in the past that are impossible for us to now access. All we have is evidence in the present, and our interpretation and narrativization of that evidence. This means that the way the text is produced is contingent on the author's decisions in the present. You have the facts, then the narration of the facts, the way that the story is told. How the story is narrated depends on elements such as focalization, which is whose point of view and when, tenses and timings, the duration spent on specific events, order, intensity, frequency, and ethical preferences. Not to mention aesthetic choices, grammar, tropes, metaphor. The point? That none of this is detached from the facts. History, like any social science, and much of the discourse on natural sciences too, is unavoidably, in part, imagined. Discourses are the product of imagining human minds. They're part of the stories that we tell ourselves. So if this is the case, what is detachment actually meant to mean? The virtues of the concept are often taken for granted, but it's a notoriously difficult concept to define. Detachment is meant to remove the prejudices of the self from the subject matter, severing biases, enabling the historian to rationally consider all sources equally, letting the evidence speak for itself. But what exactly is meant to be detached? As we've seen, it's impossible to detach our own minds when producing a narrative. Aesthetic, moral, and ideological choices are much a product of feeling as fact, as is the way we approach, collect, and interpret these facts in the first place. Historians are often driven by personal feelings that are either excluded from the narrative or hidden behind the lines. Simply by writing a story, we are unavoidably contributing to ethical questions in an inevitably aesthetic manner. In the last video, I talked about Romanticism. The Romantics knew that it was impossible to detach the self. Humans are a part of nature, and the imagination is part of what it is to be human. Romantics believed in a transcendent nature that moves through, affects and inspires the visionary and autonomous individual, an individual who then creates their own imaginative and personal perspective on humanity and the world. In short, they emphasized the power of the human imagination to contribute to the future. Which stories we tell each other and how we tell them matters. The poet Samuel Coleridge, for example, positioned the imagination as primary, as the living power and prime agent of all human perception. The Romantic historians shared these beliefs. They idealised elements of the past, poeticising them in the present with the intention of contributing to an improved human future. They didn't sacrifice truth, but were equally as concerned with stirring the reader's sympathies, moving their moral imaginations, and engaging their senses to the feel of the subject matter of the past. Augustin Thierry, for example, wanted to write a national history of France so that the reader's imagination and human sympathy can attach itself to entire populations. Thomas Carlyle called for stern accuracy in inquiring and bold imagination in expounding and filling up. John Stuart Mill praised Carlyle's The French Revolution for its combination of fact and feeling, the history of the French Revolution and the poetry of it, both in one, the truest of histories. As the scientific approach to history emerged, Heinrich Heine complained that neither it nor aesthetic poetry alone harmonises fully with our vivid sense of life. Jules Michelet acknowledged the natural sentiments that moved him to imagine the past in an idiosyncratic way. When his wife died, his heart was torn to pieces, but from these emotions arose a violent and almost frenetic energy, which gave his history of France its strange power. On the French Revolution, Michelet wrote that the people, like children gone astray, have at last found a mother, and that fraternity has removed every obstacle. Michelet romantically emphasises unity, love, and universality in the revolution's early phase, and laments its betrayal. He invokes metaphors of geography, mountainous barriers between men torn down, and liberty being given birth. He did this while carefully weighing evidence, but acknowledged that he must follow the path marked out by the emotions of the heart. Feelings, emotions, and the imagination, made up as they are of atoms, molecules, and chemicals, are as much a part of empirical reality as diaries, minutes, and newspaper reports. Not including what someone feels and imagines about their subject, then, is unempirical. As the novelist Penelope Lively suggests in her novel According to Mark, historians fail to relate the entire truth by ignoring their own minds. Only novelists tell the truth. Only a novel is complete in its own terms. To write romantically is to acknowledge, reflect, and comment on the feelings and sentiments that attach, not detach, the author to specific subjects, ideas, actors, or moments. It's to reattach the self and to identify the moments that move us to approach, analyse, and produce narratives in our own idiosyncratic way. To be truthful is to acknowledge the passions. To be scientific is to implot as a poet. To be objective is to transcribe the subjective. Reason and imagination are undetachable. The German philosopher Schlegel called this the romantic imperative.
If you like these videos, I need your help, and here's my request. If you think you get the same value from 4 of these videos as you do from just 1 cup of coffee, then please consider pledging just $1 per video. That's $3 to $4 per month to keep this channel going. You can even limit your pledge to $1 a month, and if you pledge $5, I'll add your name to the credits. To those that already support Then and Now, thank you so much. This channel just wouldn't exist without you. You can also hit like, share, follow me on Twitter and Facebook, etc. All of these things really contribute to helping Then and Now grow. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.